Do you know what time it is? Why, it's time to learn.
Pattern weaving with the border. Weaving lesson number 1. Create 2 different patterns on 2 separate pieces of paper. Step 1. Draw out 2 patterns on 2 separate pieces of paper. Okay, so for this first pattern I'm making, I'm really gonna do a bunch of triangles of different sizes because I really like using triangles in patterns. It's fun to make patterns using triangles, don't you think? Yupper doodle. So for the second pattern I'm going to make for my second piece of paper, I'm going to make some ovals and turn them into some cones, and then really do a lot of experiments with lines and have fun with making patterns with lines. Wow, I really like the way the lines made this drawing turn out. I wonder what it's going to look like next to the other one. Oh boy, do those sure look nice together. I can't wait to turn these 2 drawings into a weaving, but first I'm gonna do something I really like to do.
It's time to learn.
Step 2. Color patterns on both pieces of paper. So I had to speed this video up in order to save time, but please know that I am taking my time when I'm drawing. I really love to color, and I hope you do too. When you're coloring, you kind of watch the direction and the lines that you're making and try to make it look nice. And here we have pattern number 1. I sure like how that turned out, don't you? When I'm coloring my second pattern in, I think I'm just going to use one color for this. When you make a picture and you color it in with only one color, they have a special word for that. It's called monochromatic. Mono just means one, and chromatic just means color. So this pattern is actually going to be monochromatic. How about that? I'm really having fun in this drawing, making dark, medium, and light shades of purple. When you put a dark next to a medium and a medium next to a light, they call that value. How about all those words? But it sure is just fun to color them there, kiddos, let me tell you. And there you have it. Pattern number 2. How about that? There's my 2 patterns next to each other. I sure hope it looks good when I put them together in my weaving.
It's time to learn.
Weaving lesson number 2. So in weaving, there's these 2 kinds of threads. There's the warp, and then there's the weft. Warp and weft are the 2 basic components used in weaving to turn thread or yarn into fabric. The warp is the part of the weaving that is attached to the frame. For our patterns, our frame will just be the outside edge of our paper. The weft is the part of a weaving that goes over and under the warp. You put the warp and the weft together and you will start to create a fabric if you're using cloth or string, or for us, we're just going to make a weaving. Making a warp for weaving.
It's time to learn.
To try to explain warp and weft to you, I'm going to put my patterns down for a moment and just use a piece of paper and a different black piece of paper to show you the difference between the warp and the weft when you're weaving. To make a warp on a weaving, you take one piece of paper and cut 5 long slits in it. To make the weft, I first fold a piece of paper into eighths. Then I'm going to carefully cut along the folds in the paper. Doing this will give you 8 long strips of paper for your weaving.
It's time to learn.
Now it's time for a weaving demonstration. I'm going to do the demonstration with black and white paper so you can see the weaving easier. To do a weaving, I'm going to take my weft and I'm going to go in and out of the warp. So it's kind of an over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under. It's kind of one of those kind of patterns. Some people like to call it an A-B pattern, where you'll see that there's an A to the pattern and a B to the pattern, then an A to the pattern, then a B. But what I'm doing is I'm just going underneath the warp with the weft in an over-under way. This is weaving the paper together. Can you believe that when putting the weft through the warp on the second row, I do the opposite of the first row? So if the first row there's like a white portion, the second row will be black, and then it's white black, so it almost looks like a checkerboard pattern. All the while I'm going in front of and then behind my warp with my weft. I'm just going to keep putting strips of my weft through the warp until my entire warp paper is filled up with a weaving. When it's done, it should look like a checkerboard pattern. Okay, now that I've showed you how to make a weaving using the black and white papers, I'm going to show you how to do the same thing with the patterns. The reason I did it with the black and white papers first is because it's easier to see it that way. Now it's time for us to weave our patterns together.
It's time to learn.
Making a warp for weaving. First thing you gotta do is pick one of your patterns that you want to make into your warp. Take your pattern and fold it in half. Then put it on your hand like an old school tent and point to the fold. You need to know where the folded side is when your paper is folded in half to do this, because you take that and then fold it in half again. That should make your paper have a center line on it now, so you know where the middle is when it's time to draw your lines for cutting. Leaving about 2 fingers of space on the outside edge of my paper, I'm going to draw a line going down the center fold towards the folded side of my paper. Then I'm going to draw a line on either side of my center line, giving me 3 lines. Then I'm going to add one more line on each side of my center folded paper. So I'll actually do a total of 5 cuts. I'm going to take my pattern and that I drew those lines on the back. I'm going to fold it up and then I'm going to cut slits going down. But I'm not going to cut all the way down, because if I did, I'd cut my paper in half. I'm just going to cut slits going down to about 2 fingers of space at the edge of the paper. That should give you a little bit of a border for your weaving. When you open up your picture then, should have a bunch of slits cut in it. That is going to be the warp for your weaving. How about that? Now it's time to turn your other pattern into the weft for your weaving. First you take your pattern and then you keep it horizontal and then fold it in half. Make sure that you make a nice even fold when you do it. So then I take it, keep it folded in half, and then I'm going to fold it in half again. This is a little trickier, and try to be careful to make it line up as best as you can. The better that you line it up, the easier it is to weave. This is when it gets kind of tricky, kiddos. You got to fold it back up so it's folded into quarters, and it gets kind of bunchy. It's kind of, when you have the paper folded up that much, it gets tricky because it's kind of hard to fold. But you have to take this quarter fold and then fold it one last time. And you really gotta smush it to make it a nice even fold, because then you will have your paper divided into, drumroll please, 8 long pieces of strips of paper. Look at that. Pretty cool, huh? Then what you do is you get a scissors and carefully cut along the folds. This is to cut the weft for your weaving, and be careful to try to make it as clean as a cut as you can, because it makes it easier to weave if you have even strips of paper. So if you did it right, your pattern should be cut into 8 long strips of paper. This is going to be the weft of your weaving. Lesson 3. Weaving patterns together. So think back to that demonstration I just did with the black and white paper, and just see how I am just doing the same thing. I'm going underneath the warp with the weft, and then over top, and then underneath. So it's over, under, A, B, A, B, A, B, until you get this pattern. When you're putting in your second strip, make sure that you go the opposite of the first. So if the first strip is on top of the warp, you have to go underneath. And then if it's underneath, you have to go on top. And then underneath, on top, underneath. A, B, A, B. All the way across your weaving. I'm going to keep adding weft and going into the warp as many strips as I can until I get to the edge of my warp. And then I'm just going to kind of sturdy everything up by moving all of my weft pieces kind of together. And there you have it. I always get kind of nervous when I cut my artwork into making patterns, but it's totally worth it. This looks super neato.
It's time to learn.
Lesson 4. Making a border. To make a border for my weaving, I'm going to take a third piece of paper and I'm going to fold it in half vertically. That's the long way. And so do you see how it kind of follows the tall vertical part of my weaving? I'm going to use that folded side to draw and create my border. So I'm going to stand it on my hand like a tent, point to the fold, know where that fold is when I do this. That fold is all important, so then you know where you're cutting. So I'm going to make a shape, but I'm going to have it going towards the fold, and I'm just going to kind of make it. I like making mine with a wavy line, but you can make yours however you want. But just make sure that it goes all the way to the edges and around the outside of the paper. So, and also that it's pointing towards the fold. So when we cut this out, it won't cut your paper in half. And then we start to cut it out. You just keep it folded up, and then you notice how I'm cutting on with like the ink line on one side of my cut. I always kind of like to do that. I'm just going to follow that edge. If my line is something I don't like when I'm cutting, I just like change my mind when I cut. a lot. The line is just more of a guide. There we go. So now I'm going to take my border, line it up on the edges of my weaving, and I'm going to tape my edges down. Some of you, if you have glue sticks or glue and you want to do it that way, that's fine too. You just put a little glue on the back of the border and stick it down. And so yeah, just going to use some tape. I'm going to go on just a couple of pieces. In all seriousness, I actually kind of like how that border sticks up a little bit. I like the shadows that it makes. So I'm just going to put a couple pieces of tape on mine. A lot of times kids like to put theirs down a little more, and that's okay too. It's really how you like doing it on this. But make sure that you get it so it doesn't fall apart. That border kind of helps it keep together, and it makes your weaving look like a complete work of art. And there you have it, a weaving with a border. I sure like it. I think it's pretty neato. I hope you did too.
Soon I found what I was looking for.
Thanks for watching and stay safe out there.